Thank you for tuning in to today's full episode of the Breaking Changes podcast. I'm your host and chief evangelist for Postman, Ken Lane. With Breaking Changes, we explore topics from the world of APIs, but through the lens of business and engineering leadership. Joining me today, we have Rico Cordova, head of content engineering for Samsung TV Plus. I found Rico's approach to building teams very solid, and I've been thinking about his views on dealing with our legacies ever since we first talked. I always start really simple with the basics. Who are you and what do you do?
My name is Rico Cordova. I'm the head of engineering for Samsung TV Plus. I'm part of the back-end engineering team that you don't ever hear about.
And that's a good thing though, right? Because like we don't want any outages or issues or anything like that, and you're the person who's going to make that happen for me, right?
Yeah, hopefully. That's exactly right. If you ever hear about our team, it's probably because you got neck deep in something that's bad. So hopefully you'll never hear about us.
So I want to learn about hear about your journey because for me, TV's interesting as part of an overlap with the online world, entertainment so much, but the world's evolves with the internet and kind of pushed us into this new realm. So how did you get started in the TV industry? Like what brought you to this role?
That's a great question. The journey has been long, but in short, I found my way to the software development world from mathematics and electrical engineering. I found the elegance of software so compelling that I just loved being able to basically create whatever I could in my mind in the real world. And very natural progression is through web development, and I always kind of favored back end frameworks, that kind of stuff. um, and that really drove me into the network of people that I could associate with that led me to Verizon, which I joined the team working on the Uplink product, which is an OTT streaming service that Verizon used for many years. It's no longer with Verizon, but that's how I eventually entered this space. And I was very lucky in the sense that it was maybe arguably the most major player at the time. It was the back end for ESPN, ABC, Disney, thousands of news networks, and it was a live streaming was really where they made their bread and butter. The sports events, Super Bowl and NBA Finals. That was the primary focus for wanting to put feature sets together and stability, because that was the offering that service provided that no other service really in the space could provide that level or that type of feature set. And then I transitioned from there to Pluto TV, which was a natural transition. It was many of the same people that I worked with from Verizon were at Pluto. And then from Pluto, I transitioned to Samsung. And the role that I played at Pluto and Samsung are going to be very, very much their same role, is they overseeing teams that are in charge of the back end delivery service, and encoding processes, ingestion processes.
So this is from like the time content gets created all the way to like we're actually seeing it. Is that whole delivery pipeline?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to talk like video OTT streaming 101, you can think of it as there is some content partner, somebody who has stuff that wants people to view it. And then you want to, of course, it depends on how you do it. There's ad driven or subscription driven. There's some sort of revenue model that you need to generate. I mean, it's a business. It has to be able to pay its people, all that. And so once you figure all that out, you need to somehow provide all the data necessary for the company, the business, us, our product, to be able to play that back for people, right? So that's an ingestion process. You give us obviously the video itself, but metadata about the video so that we can populate what they call the EPG, electronic programming guide, right? So when you're flipping through, you know what it is, who's in it, all those details, right? We need to be able to access that, and it's not something that you get access to and redeliver out right away, right? You need to ingest that, process it, distribute it to all the arms of the ecosystem that you're trying to deal with, so that all the different disparate systems know what to do with all that data. Then there is the process of actually getting it out, right? So we've now brought it into the ecosystem. We know what to do with it, and now we need to deliver it to you as the viewer. So you jump on your tablet or on your browser or whatever, and you access our back-end services that will deliver to you very specific pieces of information that put together rules that your player then knows how to interpret to give you the video back in the way that you want to view it. And the teams that I work with are very much the ingestion portion of that and then the playback portion of that. So there's a lot of other stuff going on in the middle, and I'm on the tail ends of both sides.
Wow. So, I mean, as technologists, we tend to focus on the technical details, the APIs. I'm guessing there's a nice spread of APIs across that spectrum. But how much of what you do is technical versus people-oriented teams? How do you make this pipeline flow?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I am to emphasize that whole middle section of ecosystem, all the disparate systems, would not be possible if we didn't do correct APIs. So that's to highlight. APIs are important. That's a great question though about the mix between the management and the technology. I would say that really depends on the state of the team and what initiative is being done at that moment. So to give you an example, if you have a stable team that has just tried and true technology, then when I'm managing those teams, I'm very much like what they call player coach, where I'll get in, I'll do maybe 30% of coding, that kind of thing, and then the rest of it's on maybe architecture, a little bit of people management, a little bit of process, reviewing, making sure that what we're doing makes sense, that kind of stuff. But if you're in a maybe an ecosystem where you have to grow teams very quickly, there's a lot of demand, new initiative, it's a new merger, something like that, then my technical involvement tends to drop significantly because there's way more overhead of trying to facilitate conversations between the two merging engineering teams, trying to identify what people will merge together to create what new Scrum teams, all that kind of stuff. It takes a surprising amount of time, and if not done correctly, you can fall apart, right? You're building a foundation on toothpicks, so that you really want to make sure that you employ the best practices and standards for building teams and engineering models and onboarding processes and all that before the managers. I would say what I tend to at least recommend to my managers is before you get too closely involved in the day-to-day, make sure that we have all this other stuff stable so that when you leave for your vacation or anybody that the hit by a bus, as gruesome as that is, the hit by a bus test, you don't want to fail that. There's nobody that should be here that knows so much about what's going on that nobody else knows about, that if they were to leave suddenly for whatever reason, we don't want to be in that scenario. And so if you can build a stable engineering team around the philosophy of shared workload and no one person is the Hercules among us, then really you can have then the opportunity to dive deeper into the code and do technical things. So it's kind of one thing and then the other.
So I'm assuming it requires a lot of everything's got to be documented. There's got to be good education resources for everyone because teams are turning over maybe a little bit. You got new people that need to onboard, so it's all got to be well defined, right?
That's absolutely true. Documentation is a challenge. A lot of engineers don't like to write documentation as much as they like to write code, and that's fair enough. But the importance, especially these days, I think the model of remote work becoming so normal that it's almost needs to be an option. Any more that people have the opportunity, I can do something and I have the option to be remote at this company, and this company doesn't let me be remote. Remote is almost always the better option, right? Or at least the option for it, remote. And so that distance between us, you don't have the opportunity to rub shoulders and brainstorm and bounce ideas off of each other in a room together. So a lot more things need to be very deliberately documented step by step so that you can comfortably come in with confidence and get through the onboarding process and have enough confidence to actually then start contributing to something in production. And there is a gap to overcome to build that confidence. And if you don't document correctly, I don't think you're going to get there. Very true.
Yeah. Yeah, documentation is that critical. I would say tech to human bridge that is also often underestimated, the value and the importance of it. And it really helps grease the wheels and get people on the same page. So as you're building out this and you get it dialed in, you build your team, you get the processes all dialed in. A lot of folks approach me and say, well, when are we going to be done with this API thing? When do we just check it off? So if you set up this team and process and it's stable and running, you don't have to change or iterate on it after that, right? Or is it just ongoing constantly and you have to constantly iterate?
If only it were. Well, let me. I'm gonna answer this carefully. There are certain scenarios and systems where you can or must have that level of terminated. As an example, we're sending something out into outer space. We're not going to be able to iterate on that much, right? We need to be able to have it solid and firm when we're done. Those cases aside, the reality I live in day to day, I have never yet seen anything that is just done. You're always going to have to be iterating on it. There's going to be bugs that arise. There's going to be new versions of the software that you need to be able to update. Those new versions may introduce new bugs. Like there's just this is just the nature of the industry that we live in. But there are approaches to managing those types of systems as stable, steady state. A lot of times they're referred to as legacy, unfortunately. Services that allow you the overhead to maintain them, but they're not necessarily a huge time sink. They're not the focus. But I think you'd have to. It's a fallacy, in my opinion, to think that you can ever finish your API and call it done. You're always going to have to iterate on it.
So you touched on something interesting there that I am a big proponent of, and so you're always in forward motion, and that's the reality. That's inevitable. And how you look back at our legacy, I feel like it's very negative in how we look back at it, and that's unfortunate, as you said. And when you think about the word legacy, like me as a father, as a human being, or presidents, you want to leave a legacy. Like that's a good thing. So like, how
Yeah,
did we end up with in this state where we see it as a bad thing?
that's an excellent question too. I think in my opinion, I think it's a combination of practical experience on legacy systems. Quote, I'm using air quotes, legacy systems there. Um, I think to myself, the young version of myself, what is it that I was enthralled by, passionate about, and reading somebody else's code that was written 15 years ago wasn't on high on that list, right? So I was never excited to work on that kind of thing. So you always tried to find the opportunity to work on the next new exciting thing. Um, that I think motivates much of what we end up as culturally internally to the group. And I should emphasize every team can have their own culture in this sense, right? These are trends that I've seen across many cultures that I've been involved with. Is you get that trend of, well, people tend to like doing this more, and we want to make you happier than not happy, so we let you do it more than that. But there is an element of certain things in our job we have to do. None of us want to do, but we have to. And you just try and find a healthy mix of those so that, again, no one person's overburdened Herculean efforts on those, and that there's enough shared tasks among the group so that no one person feels like they're doing too much in any one area. Um, I honestly think that's probably the biggest motivation behind the culture we found ourselves in, where we think of them as kind of it's almost a pejorative, and like you said, it shouldn't be. Like the concept of a legacy is something good. It's something you want to leave behind. So the way that I don't like using the word legacy either, but what I've also tried to promote is the proper conversation around deprecation. Uh, we engineers like to solve problems, and we can also become very attached to our solutions. And the easiest way for a business is to be able to make very tough, quick decisions, cut ties, move forward with no lamentation, no blame, no fuss. Just, you know what, that's just not going to work today, and we're moving along without it. But that kind of decision hits hard at home in the smaller, in the team that owns that service. There's a sense of pride and ownership, as well there should be. So it's from a business, like my job as a managing or a director, I need to be able to know how to properly balance that ability to keep the morale up, the people interested in doing things, um, not unnecessarily deprecating their work, but also allow for enough agility in the business to be able to make those types of moves without causing problems with morale, and having those conversations and making sure that people understand these decisions, making sure that they can be an owner of the transition or migration to the new solution, something that will involve them so that they're not losing anything, they're more gaining something. That's a little bit of the people management balancing that you need to do in this area, I think. But the deprecation concept, I think, is vastly underused in our industry. We tend to want to support an API or a feature in an API for ever. And you know what? It just isn't economically feasible after some point. Many of you guys will know some of the older browsers, and trying to keep JavaScript compatible, it's a nightmare. And at some point, the best business decision is to say, you know what? We spend this many millions of dollars every year supporting engineering support, operational support for these things that we only see generating $5 million in revenue. It doesn't make any sense. We need to cut that support. And that conversation is very challenging because there's the customer revenue aside, the customer impact, right? You don't want to lose any customers because they can get on the social media and start just railing you left and right. So from the product point of view, it's very much, oh, we don't want to lose that. But there's the operational, like how much money, and you have to make that conversation is very challenging.
Interesting. So, like, I mean, the way you describe how you assemble your team. So, a lot of people focus on velocity, like forward velocity. So, you built up a team, you get these processes and these muscles, and everyone's exercising, kind of training in concert, and you guys are able to deliver forward at this certain velocity. But you're talking about the legacy dependencies along with that. Along that team's got to be equipped to think about and care about, and then spend equal amounts of time on the forward motion, because your forward motion's dependent on everything, all our baggage and everything behind us, right?
Absolutely true. And depending on how the original system or systems were built, you have a lot larger or smaller tasks. So the concept of those APIs, microservices in general, monoliths are not uncommon. You have a startup of 8, 10, 12 people who are all just clamoring to get something created. And then when it gets to the point where 100 people need to touch it, it was never designed or thought through and architected in such a way as to make 100 people be able to contribute. Almost inevitably, that's going to be the case. And so there's that. We need to figure out how to keep moving forward. We need to be able to grow our teams, right? We do need other people touching this, but we need to be able to do that safely. How do we start creating new, say, just I don't want to. Sometimes you are able to just completely, make a library out of something and put it off to the side. But a lot of times you have to create, kind of from the ground up, a small, what I call an evolutionary step forward, where you take certain pieces of that monolith and create a microservice out of it. Find a piece of the team that you can carve out and maybe then devote as a primary owner of that new service, still having enough legacy or tribal knowledge of how everything works, but they can be the subject matter expert of that new microservice. And that is a constant, like, it's just peeling back layers on an onion, of this, I don't onions traveling through the timeline of growth from acquisition and mergers along the way to high scale production, big player. You're going to go through that. You have to peel away pieces of it and get them into isolated territories of ownership and specialization, because it's impossible to have 100 people know everything about what everyone's doing.
Wow. Okay, so you just added another dimension. So we're this rocket ship flying through space. We're very focused on our aero, the forward motion and velocity, but we've got to be mindful of the our baggage and our legacy and our rocket fuel, I guess, what got us here through time. But now we've got acquisitions being flung at us, meteors and asteroids coming, and you've got to absorb that, and so the whole muscle and function of your team's got to be able to address all of that as one motion, not just the new features.
Yeah, it requires a lot of coordinate. This is where the management teams, the better they work together, I think the smoother this portion of the workflow can be. And when I say management teams, like your program manager and your product manager, your engineering managers, when they can communicate well around, say, as an example, as a stakeholder, I from a product person might come in and say, I need this feature, I create this user story, and that information, if it doesn't provide concrete enough goals, acceptance criteria that we can measure and then take action against those measurements at a later time, if you don't have enough of that in place, you're not providing yourself enough stable foundation to move forward. And a lot of times there's this, I understand what you're saying. I think you understand. Yeah, we understand what we're saying, and then we move forward like that, and that causes problems because maybe these two understand, but the people who are implementing or anybody along the path may not fully have that context. And so what I found, I'm a reliability engineer, and I love that stuff as a mathematician. It just comes right at me. But the concept of these indicators and objectives that you can then create thresholds against for your alerting. Simple example is I come to you with a request as a stakeholder saying I need you to deliver X amount of things in Y amount of time. Yeah, that's great and all, but if I have to do that for 1 million people all at the same time or 10 million people all at the same, there's scaling issues, right? The internet is not a perfect ecosystem, and there's going to be some amount of availability that's just naturally we're not going to be able to do anything about. And so there's a lot of 3 nines or 4 nines. You may have heard of 5 nines uptime, all this. So if you were aiming at 3 nines uptime, even if everything was working in the code perfectly, we still expect some level of breakage for that. And we need to be able to account for that and tolerate it without disrupting the team. Like if you see something that has gone wrong in production, you can't just scream at the team to fix it, because if it's only in 0.001% of the 10 million users, 10, that's 0.001% of 10 million is enough users that people are like, oh no, they could be upset. But it's not enough to disrupt the team, right? You've got to look at the numbers. And when they have specific thresholds that they can attach to that, we can build, burn down charts to look at when errors are coming off. Are they happening so frequently that we're going to break our SLOs and eventually our SLAs down the line, within say a week or two, or is it something that we can tolerate for the entire duration of this next month, and we can just put in a JIRA ticket and fix it later? That type of an idea. And it's challenging to get enough details from the stakeholders up front to build that level of knowledge into your metrics, unless those stakeholders really know what they're wanting, right? Like they really have thought through. And usually that just takes a conversation with engineers. But if you don't have that good rapport among the managers, it's very challenging to get that conversation done correctly.
Yeah, that's um, one of the biggest challenges I see folks, large enterprises have is a simple concept, seeing APIs.
Yeah.
So like being able to see an API, and then what does that mean amongst different people? Because if you're a back-end developer, like seeing an API means one thing. If you're a CTO or an architect, like seeing an API, there's different ways and different directions. And we may both say, or five of us say, yeah, I want to see that API, but like, how do you do it? And then how do you speak to that personality or role at a particular or stakeholder or at a particular part of the life cycle? But then you also kind of touched on, it's not just the producer side, it's not just us as operating, it's like who's consuming it, how many, what percentage, network, global, like it's a balanced view of seeing APIs across the producer and consumer side to really understand what we need to care about and what we don't.
Yeah, you're touching on some challenging topic. Yes, this is something that I've yet to see done perfectly. I don't know what a perfect outlook or outcome for this would be exactly, but um, yeah, let me see how I'm going to answer that.
It wasn't really a question, to be fair, so
Well,
you
yeah, no,
answer
but
it the
this is
best you can.
it's such an important thing. It's such an important topic to discuss, and the reason I say that is because you kind of alluded to, depending on the stakeholder, what they may want visibility into as far as the API will be totally different, right? Like myself as an engineer, when I want visibility into an API, I'm looking for your JSON output. I want the most raw of that data, and I will do with it whatever I want to make it happen the way I want. I understand that that's not going to be an option for every consumer or every stakeholder, right? They don't have the time or maybe the knowledge to do that kind of thing. So we wrap UIs on some of these API, right? We put documentation, Swagger Hub as an example. There are a lot of different methods for exposing what an API is, what it's doing, how it works, the actual literal functionality of it, just the theory of it, how it fits into the ecosystem. There's so much that could be said in that one general topic that you mentioned. And I think it's important to note that there's for me, a difference that is not often discussed in monitoring. There's monitoring for operations and there's monitoring as a product. And the monitoring as a product, I think, is often left off the plate because the operational monitoring is what's the primary focus, making sure that we're up and running, making sure that those 10 million viewers are getting what they want. But the monitoring as a product is that ability for our stakeholders to see, have visibility into the steps they're taking to try and generate revenue throughout their ecosystem. And if they don't have the proper visibility at any given point, they can't make the proper decisions, or they don't have clarity to make those decisions. And that is often overlooked, that visibility at that layer. And so you say a CTO, oh, there's been so many times where I've had a CTO want to see visibility into my API, and I'm like, ugh, you're a CTO, I know you have the chops, but direct visibility into my API isn't going to give you what you're looking for. I know what you're looking for, and what you're looking for is at that other layer. And it's very, like I say, very often left out of the conversation.
Yeah, yeah. And so monitoring as a product, I would say this goes well in hand with all treating APIs as a product. API product management is like the number one conversation right now that I'm seeing across the board. And it answers those questions. I mean, not that the CEO is going to come in, that outage you talked about, but is this costing us money? Is this, is it going to make people mad? How many? Like the in the moment decision decisions and what you want to see as a product owner, what the product manager, and then like you said, does this affect downstream? Can this be a ticket? Can we make the change in the next? Like this is all part of that product feedback loop that has to be in place that we respond to in the moment or respond to per sprint or per release or whatever we're doing. And without being able to see, you can't make the right decisions there.
Yeah. And in my experience, inevitably, when you have a scenario where you don't have the right visibility, everybody errs on the side of caution. And that leads to 2 a.m. calls of my engineers unnecessarily. And that is what I try to avoid. Like ultimately, my goal is to provide the engineers with as little disruption as possible to what their primary quarterly goals will look like. If I can clear their runway and just shield them from all the unnecessary interruptions, we will achieve the best velocity possible. And a lot of times that shielding can be done by simply giving some proper visibility, because then nobody needs to bug them. They can see by looking at that API UI or whatever, the documentation.
Yeah, yeah, pretty powerful stuff. I mean, just really good level, team level enablement, but helping them be more autonomous. I, I, I hear a lot of talk. One of the last conversations I had, interviews I did, there was a lot about self-service. So, do you feel like a lot of the knowledge and the capacity that your team needs access to is needs to be self-service for it to be effective?
Yeah, I was gonna throw out that buzz word. What's 2 words, right? So I guess it's a buzz phrase. I was gonna throw that out a
Buzz phrase?
few minutes ago because that to me is a very good, I would say, rule of thumb, something that may not always work every time, but if you have the option. So what I mean by that is self-service as the way for your stakeholders to get what they need. Um, we have or clients even. This is something we deal with as well. Suppose there's a series of metadata in the ecosystem that needs to be updated, right? So I talked about that ingestion process. They give you the video and all the metadata. What if they need to change some of that? Um, how would they do that? Traditionally in the past, when it was very small in the 12-person team, they just handed over an Excel spreadsheet, and an engineer would go into the database and just update all the values, right? Obviously scripted, but that's essentially a very manual process. Well, when you grow to the point where you have dozens of content ingestions happening every day and hundreds of these updates happening a week, that manual is no, steps are no longer an option. We need to create some sort of self-service step, and these layers on top of your APIs, or they'd actually the API themselves can be a level of self-service. That I think is very important. This is again where that level of product monitoring as a product, because your CTO may want to have visibility into something that you could facilitate with this, but they don't have the time to wrap it and make it pretty, and so you are obligated to, in some sense, create that for them. But yeah, you nailed it on the head.
So how do you test and validate this? Because you're trying to automate and scale this, and someone may think they're doing the right thing, but it's incorrect data or anything. So was how do you test and validate that things are what they appear all along this pipeline?
That's a that's a good question. So you may have heard the Swiss cheese analogy, where every layer along the way is like a slice of Swiss cheese, and they have a few holes in them. But if you line up several layers of Swiss cheese, hopefully no one hole can make it all the way through. I it's a very simple analogy. I know that it's more complex than that, but that kind of gives people a little bit of a visualization of what I'm trying to say here is you have unit tests, right? Your developers putting in unit tests. You have your test engineers putting in integration tests and other types of tests. Every step of the way, you're trying to find and close those holes and those gaps as best you can. Inevitably, there's going to be something that gets through, and I think for me the important part is dealing with that correctly when it happens, and then having a proper post-mortem and preventing it from happening again. Um, all of that with the no blame, right? We're here to just figure out what went wrong. This layer of sliced cheese thing is a good analogy also, because it emphasizes that it's no one person. When there's a failure, even if it was your name on that git commit, it was a failure of all of us. It was institutional failure, because we should have processes put in place to prevent those types of failures. And the important thing is to identify what went wrong, how to prevent that in the future, and then just make a simple change to make sure that never happens again, and just move on with our lives. But yeah, that's basically my answer.
Yeah, no, I like it. And I would to bring it back to another buzz phrase that I hear a lot is shift left. So when it comes to security, it's a big one. You're supposed to be securing things earlier on in the process. Have your security requirements as part of the requirements process, and then equip developers as early as possible to do more with proven security infosec practices. But and one because of the buzziness of it, what I don't hear people talk about and what I heard you talk about is, well, we got to have processes for dealing with these things when they happen. Acknowledge they're going to happen and learn and grow from that and have a culture where that's acceptable, but we do everything we can to prevent it. So it's not just about moving things left and equipping people. It's the full process and life cycle.
Yeah, good observation. I hadn't really thought about much of the ops, like SecOps type of stuff. That prevents that provides a whole other layer of complexity. This is as actually, if I could share just a small story about that. As an engineering manager, I understand the value of providing all these security, like you say, writing them directly into our architecture and design documents so that we are thinking security first. Absolutely 100% agree with that. The challenge, though, that engineering managers have, and if you're anybody who's on the opposite end or just not in the engineering structure, please bear with us on this. We don't necessarily decide the priority of our work. And in fact, we don't decide that. The business decides that for us. And we do our best effort to do what the business tells us. And so if there are security issues that need to be handled, I absolutely want to handle them, but if the business is telling me that no, 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 we want to do this instead, I have to do what the business tells me. And that causes a lot of friction sometimes between the engineering teams and the security teams, or the SecOps or whatever you want to call them. That is unfortunately it's unnecessary. It shouldn't be there, because that's not how the process would work anyway, right? The any A stakeholder doesn't just come directly to the engineering group and say, please finish, do this work for us. They submit a work request. That request is then prioritized, and that's just the way it always works. And so I do my best to try and explain to the business on behalf of those teams why I think they should prioritize this work ahead of this other work. But if they decide to make a decision, I've got nothing, right? And that I think has been very challenging when you're saying like the security first. There are things that I've seen implemented that prevent development work from being done because the tribal version, the old way of doing it, gave them too much access to this part of the ecosystem. But by cutting off that access, it prevents us from doing a release. And we can't have that, right? And those are the conversations that I find to be very challenging.
Interesting. Yeah, I've seen the same struggles playing out at the API gateway layer because gateways were kind of, you bought the big appliance, it was a top-down decision, and everyone had to like hang their stuff on the central gateway. But then microservices and kind of team autonomy came in, and they're like, well, we're running Nginx and other smaller gateways in different groups, and and then I'm seeing the same with governance play out, where centralized center of excellence is hand down like, here's the standards and guidelines, and and then they get pitchforks and torches from teams going, oh no, we're not going to do that, like, what are you talking about, you're crazy. And so like, how I feel like there's got to be a balance to security standards, governance, all of it, observability, to make sure teams are enabled and equipped, and it's not just some centrally or gate kept type of process.
The centralization, that the concept there, um, I've always been the proponent of no more standards than is necessary to make sure that everybody is on the same page. There are different ways of saying that, like enough standards to make sure that everybody's doing the same thing, but no more than that. Things like that. Those are what I tend to respond when I hear centers of excellence coming out and saying, blanket, we all have to use this method, this way of using Docker and Helm or whatever. Um, I always try and approach it as, well, that's going to work for most of the cases, but there are these older cases, these repos that were not designed with those modern sensibilities in mind, that we need to be able to accommodate for, again, because the engineers can't stop. That's our primary goal, is to keep those engineers moving. And I think it's my job as engineering director or management to help other leaders understand those limitations and then adjust policies and practices across the business to better accommodate the reality that we work in. Um, it's always one of those, you have a datum of, and I'm a proponent of this, you have a datum of the ideal. And I'm a nerd. Thermodynamics, the Carnot engine is that ideal engine. It's the perfect engine, right? And the existence of that in theory is worthwhile. It's worth discussing because you can then measure how close you are to that perfect. And without that measurement, that's the visibility I'm talking about. Without that measurement, you won't know how to best make your changes. And for me, I think this is a major part of that. Standards. You set a standard because it's your ideal. It's what you want to get to, but don't expect everyone to be able to do it right away. Definitely not right away. Or maybe even some cases, I'll tell you what, you get me to some edge compute problems, and I'll tell you right now, there are going to be some things that are just going to not fly. You're just not going to be able to have that level of control when you get to certain types of scenarios. So you need to have a datum for your perfection, but you also need to allow for not perfection and a process to allow for it.
Wow. Wow. That's yeah. I think that's pragmatic, realistic, that's honest. That helps us I think stay truthful to it rather than just expecting perfection and not never quite getting there, but understanding the spectrum of where we can operate, what's acceptable, what's not, how far are we from that perfection. Wow. Yeah, and it seems like you can create the optimal environment in this. I mean, and not that optimal is a constant. Like optimal could mean different things in different moments. But do you feel like this allows you to dial in and give your team breathing room? I mean, do you guys have room to innovate? What does innovation look like because you're able to dial this in like that?
That's an excellent question too. The innovation I tend to leave to the engineering manager. So in my role, I manage several managers, and each of those managers have their own team or scrum teams in some cases. And I tend to let them decide what type of innovation they want during our innovation period. So we have some time set aside every quarter for the teams to do some level of innovation for several weeks. And sometimes I would say 50-50. that innovation time is and can be used very well for innovation things, getting the that whole concept of being able to just kind of take a step out of your normal, do something, shake off the cobwebs, and just change it up. Very, very good for that. But at the same time, there's a lot of pressures coming to these engineering managers to deliver things that they've committed to deliver that have not gone the way that they planned, and now they're a little bit behind schedule and all this. And sometimes it's better overall for the team, for that manager to say, you know what, we're just gonna miss out on our innovation, or at least a portion of our innovation time, and finish this up, get the monkey off of our back. It'll all make us feel better having just delivered that and gotten it finished. And so I think that cuts a lot into the innovation time that's available to us, but it's not necessarily a bad thing, because innovation, one, I think is very good for the business. And if they really did want us to have more time to innovate, they would allow that, right? Like they would allow us to hire more people who are R&D teams or whatever. They can facilitate that if they really want to. So it's really up to us to make sure that we're using that time for our purposes, building up that morale, right? Shaking it off, resetting everything. And a lot of that stuff can occur with just finishing up an initiative and just wiping your hands of it and moving on. So,
Yeah, yeah, no, it's an interesting balance, and how it's got to be load balanced across an organization, prioritization. There's a lot to think about there. Um, Innovation, beyond that, like, what do you do personally to keep you excited and passionate beyond just your work? And what keeps you going and doing all of this?
Um, I'm always just been a fan of learning. I think this is a common trait among a lot of people. Is just I'm anytime I get a chance to expose myself to new problems, new scenarios, new situations that I've not yet seen how to deal with, solve, whatever. I'm a sponge. I just want to see it happen, right? And so from the technology side, I've been in this technology for a while now, and you'll never cap out, right? In any industry, no matter what you're learning, you're always going to be able to learn more. New frameworks come out every year, new technology, new best practices, new conferences. There's just never an end to that. But what I've found is that the amount of effort that I put into that. And so, it's my job. So obviously I try and stay current on things and read blog posts and read on all the things and get at least an understanding of how the technology works in my space, and maybe dabble with it on a Saturday afternoon to, build something around the API. Uh, that's very common, but I find that my time spent there, 10 hours spent there, is going to gain me a small amount of extra knowledge or extra expertise or extra value to the business or the team. Whereas if I spent that same amount of time learning something a little bit outside of my wheelhouse but very relevant to the team, I can gain a lot more for us. And what I mean by that is being involved with, say, initiatives with other parts of the business groups. Um, if I can identify a potential partnership of services or something that the business really hasn't thought of or whatever, and there's an initiative there that I can help champion, I am going to gain a lot of experience about that. The international business maybe, or just general project management and team like bringing together two parts of businesses, groups, mergers. Uh, all of those things I think are the types of experience that as I grow now, I'm going to gain the most from learning about. And so I try and tend to focus more on those types of things, making sure that all the different teams across all the different organizations know how to work with my teams, and that they have the visibility and accountability outside to all those teams, so that they are comfortable and confident that we're doing what we're claiming to do.
Wow. Have you always been this curious, even as a kid and like in high school and stuff?
I really was. Unfortunately, when I was younger as a kid, I didn't have um, an outlet for it, I guess, or there was no. We didn't identify early that I was this curious. Let's just say I was just very
Yeah.
active. I was always doing things. I wasn't necessarily always getting into trouble. I was just a little kid always doing stuff, right? And then as I got older, I found that there was a passion for mathematics, and
Mm.
when I opened up that passion for mathematics and really dove in, that's where I got my degree. Um, it exposed me to a level of insight and knowledge about the world around me that helped me develop more of that curiosity. So you get mathematics together with physics, and I actually was, I say electrical engineer. I started as mechanical engineer. So the first 2.5 years of my schooling, I was mechanical engineer. So we did materials engineering, that type of thing. And so I know enough about a lot of things about like how materials behave under pressures, under tensions, and I can look at like a building, I can look at anything built in the real world. And obviously I don't know, I have to look at the design to really know it, but I have like an intuitive understanding of how it works, why it was built that way, what they must have thought about during their designs, and I find myself just tumbling down those rabbit holes all the time. And so I just can't help myself. It's just a fascination for me to learn something new.
I'm guessing that's a blessing, but it could also be a curse in some situations.
Yes, very much. I think a lot of our idiosyncrasies are that you have to learn how to properly manage them. I have to force myself to take breaks, meditation time, to calm it down, to wind it back down. My wife is fortunately just very good at that. She can identify if I've been spending too much time in the rabbit hole, and she's like, "All right, here's a meal. We're taking a break. You're gonna come with me to do this." And having
Nice.
that partnership really has helped me accelerate my career because I know how better to balance my life now.
You described my relationship with my wife as well. That's how she keeps me grounded, keeps me fed, keeps me here on this earth for I think the next 40, 50 years, I'm hoping. So, well, this has been fascinating, man. I really enjoyed this journey with you.
Yes.
I appreciate you coming and sharing with me today. I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks again to Rico for stopping by. You can find more about Samsung at samsung.com, and Rico's on LinkedIn. You can also subscribe to the Breaking Changes podcast at postman.com/events/breaking changes. I'm your host, Kin Lane, and until next time, cheers.